There is a story historians keep returning to, one that unsettled the people who first uncovered it. In English cemeteries dating back centuries, researchers examining skeletal remains found peasants, people who owned almost nothing, with bone density and muscle attachment that looked more like an athlete's than an elderly laborer's. In the graves nearby, marked by wealth, gold rings still on finger bones, the remains told the opposite story: early degeneration, disease, bodies that failed decades before they should have. It is just a story people point to, but it asks a real question. How did people with nothing outlast people with everything? Modern researchers have now measured the actual mechanism directly, in retirees like you, and it has almost nothing to do with diet or hard labor. It has to do with what happens to your body the moment a reason to get up each morning disappears. The real numbers on purpose. Here is what a major, long-running study out of the National Institute on Aging actually found. Researchers followed more than 8,000 adults, aged 50 and older, through what is called the Health and Retirement Study. They tracked who reported a strong sense of daily purpose and who did not. Then they tracked, years later, who was still alive. The adults with the lowest sense of purpose were over 3 times more likely to die within the follow-up period than those with the highest sense of purpose. 3 times. Not from one disease, not from a single identifiable risk factor that shows up on a chart. This was across the board, controlling for baseline health, income, and the usual variables researchers account for. The retirement myth: keeping busy. Stay with me here, because this is where most people take this finding and get the lesson completely wrong. You might be thinking this means you need to find a hobby, keep busy, fill your calendar with something, anything. That is not what the research is actually describing, and treating it that way is precisely the mistake that keeps otherwise careful retirees from protecting themselves. This is not a psychological nicety you can paper over with a crossword puzzle. It is physiological, measurable, happening below the level of how you feel day to day. For decades, your working life quietly regulated your cortisol rhythms, the timing and depth of your sleep, your cardiovascular function, not because you were consciously managing any of it, but because something needed you to show up every day. Your entire biological system built its rhythm around that demand, without you ever noticing it was happening. Think about what a normal workday actually asked of your body. A reason to move through the morning with intention, instead of drifting through it. Small recurring stress, a deadline, a difficult conversation, a problem that needed solving, followed reliably by resolution and rest. That cycle of demand and recovery is exactly what keeps a cardiovascular system flexible and a stress response system calibrated correctly. Remove the demand entirely, and the system does not simply relax into permanent ease the way most people expect retirement to feel. It loses its calibration instead. The same way a muscle loses strength when a joint stops bearing any weight at all. The unavoidable structure. Peasants never had to think about any version of this problem. Survival itself was the structure, permanent and unavoidable. There was no version of retirement where the work simply stopped and nothing replaced it. The fields still needed tending regardless of age. The animals still needed feeding whether you felt like it or not. The next season was always waiting, and it needed you specifically, every single day, until the day you died. That structure was never a lifestyle choice anyone made deliberately. It was completely unavoidable, built into the basic mechanics of staying alive. And it turns out, that unavoidable daily structure was doing something for the human body that no supplement, no walking routine, and no amount of retirement savings can replace on its own once it is gone. Modern retirement removes that structure in a single afternoon, sometimes literally in a single day. The celebration happens, the relief arrives, genuine and well-earned, and then a particular Monday comes with no alarm set, no meeting on the calendar, no place that needs you to physically arrive. Your body registers that disappearance as a loss, whether or not your conscious mind has finished processing it as one. The hidden cost of drifting. And here is the part that should genuinely concern you if you are the one managing a retirement budget, not just your own well-being. Consider 2 retirees, same age, same starting health at the moment they leave the workforce, same size nest egg sitting in the same kinds of accounts. Retiree 1 replaces the daily structure that work used to provide, deliberately, on purpose, from the very first month. Retiree 2 lets that structure simply dissolve, and assumes free time will naturally fill the gap. The research on purpose and physical decline strongly suggests these two retirees are no longer on the same trajectory. Even though nothing about either of their charts looks different on the day they both walked out of their final workplace. Faster muscle loss shows up in one, sharper cognitive decline shows up in one, and none of those, individually, look dramatic when they first appear, a little more tired, a little more forgetful. But each of those small things is quietly a line item waiting to happen. A fall that leads to a hospital stay, and then a rehabilitation facility, a cognitive decline that turns into needing daily help at home, whether that help is a family member rearranging their life, or a paid aide coming in 5 days a week. A weakened system that turns a routine illness into an extended, expensive one, with its own cascade of consequences. The reality of long-term care. Long-term care in this country is not a rare expense reserved for unlucky families who drew a bad hand. According to Genworth and CareScout's National Cost of Care Survey, a private room in a nursing home now runs a median of over $129,000 a year. Assisted living runs a median of over $74,000 a year, and roughly 7 out of 10 people will need some form of long-term care in their lifetime. Most families only start pricing any of this out after the need has already arrived, which is exactly the wrong time to discover what it actually costs. These are not small monthly line items. They are the kind of expense that can quietly consume a retirement account that took 30 years to build, in a fraction of that time. And the timeline for when you actually need any of it, not whether you eventually will, but when the clock starts, is being shaped right now, today, by something as invisible and unmeasured as whether you have a real reason to get out of bed tomorrow morning. This is not a hypothetical sitting between two imaginary people. It is closer to a fork in the road that neither retiree can see they are standing at, because nothing about it shows up on paper until years later, when one of them is still managing their own home, driving their own car, and running their own schedule, and the other has already needed daily help for longer than either of them ever expected going in. That is the actual stakes underneath the question this video is asking, not, you happy in retirement, but whether the years sitting between the money you already saved and the money you will eventually need are years you get to keep for yourself, or years that get quietly taken from you, earlier than they had to be. The second danger, isolation. Now, here is the second half of what the peasants had, almost entirely by accident, that most retirees today have lost completely, and it does not sit apart from the first problem, it compounds it. Isolation, inside a peasant village, was not really a possible state to be in. Labor was shared out of necessity, meals were shared because that was simply how food worked, illness was tended to by neighbors because there was no other option available to anyone. Community was not a wellness recommendation printed on a pamphlet somewhere. It was the actual infrastructure that kept people alive through hard winters, through crop failures, through every disaster that could and did happen. Nobody had to schedule connection into their week. It was built directly into the geography of daily survival, unavoidable in the same way the fieldwork was unavoidable. Modern life, especially the version that arrives right after retirement, does almost exactly the opposite. Careers end, and with them the daily contact with colleagues you never had to work at maintaining. Children build lives of their own, often in other cities entirely, and technology, for all its real and genuine benefits, makes it entirely possible to move through an entire day, start to finish, without a single moment of actual human presence in the room with you. The research on what this specifically costs is sobering, and it is precise enough to name real numbers rather than vague impressions. A large study out of the Chicago Health and Aging Project found that the most socially isolated older adults faced a 90% increased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease compared to their more connected peers of the same age. Among those who reported genuine loneliness, not just physical isolation, but the felt, subjective sense of being alone regardless of how many people were technically nearby, that risk climbed even further, to 117%. That is not a small statistical nudge buried in a footnote. That is close to doubling the risk of one of the most devastating, most expensive conditions a retirement can ever face. And these two forces, purpose and connection, are not actually separate from each other. Even though this video has walked through them one at a time, a retiree who has lost their sense of daily purpose is far more likely to also be isolated, because the exact structures that used to deliver both of these at the same time, without any deliberate effort on anyone's part, are the same structures retirement just removed, in one motion. Purpose and connection were never two different peasant habits sitting side by side. They were one structure, doing two jobs simultaneously, and modern retirement dismantles both of them at once, unless you go out of your way to deliberately rebuild them from scratch. The prescription. So, here is what actually matters. Once every historical detail and every study citation in this video gets stripped away, your body does not decline on a fixed schedule tied to the number printed on your birth certificate. It declines measurably faster when the daily structure that used to demand your presence disappears. And it declines faster still when the community that used to surround you disappears alongside it. Neither of those two losses shows up on a standard lab test. Neither one gets a diagnosis code at your next checkup. Your doctor cannot flag it on a chart, and your financial advisor has no line item for it either, even though it may end up shaping your finances more than almost anything else in your retirement plan. But both of these quiet losses are continuously determining how many years of genuine physical and financial independence you actually get to keep, and how many of those years get handed over early to paid care that could have been delayed, or in some cases, avoided entirely. None of this requires you to have predicted it decades in advance. It requires noticing it now, while there is still every opportunity to rebuild what retirement removed. The prescription sitting underneath all of this is not complicated, and it does not cost anything close to what a long-term care bill eventually would. It does not require a program, a membership fee, or a specialist referral. It requires one specific concrete thing that needs you, by name, on a recurring basis, the same way the fields needed the peasant, and the village needed every set of working hands it had left. Mentoring someone starting out in a skill you spent decades mastering, teaching that skill formally, even one afternoon a week, a standing commitment, weekly, involving other people in the room with you, something that does not quietly disappear if you skip it once, but that someone else genuinely notices if you disappear from entirely. This week, pick exactly one. Not a list of 5 resolutions you will abandon by February. One single, specific commitment that puts you back in a room with other people on a schedule that is not optional and not easily canceled. Protect that commitment the way you would protect any other line item in your retirement plan, because based on everything in this video, that is precisely what it actually is. If any part of this connected some dots for you, send it to someone in your life who retired recently and seems to be quietly drifting, a parent who mentioned having more time than they know what to do with, a neighbor whose calendar emptied out faster than they expected. That offhand sentence people say, about having too much time now, is worth taking seriously. This is actually the first video in a short series looking at what quietly protected people for most of human history, without them ever realizing it was protecting them, and at what modern retirement accidentally took away, in exchange for all its comfort. Subscribe if you want the next one the moment it is ready, because the piece of this puzzle we are covering next goes even further into territory most retirement planning never touches at all.